The NFL Combine is in the books. We now have the testing information from those who tested. Not everyone, Shawn, as we know, tested over the past couple of days, but pretty interesting weekend of testing. Some historic things happening. Shawn, we won't talk about it too much here in the podcast, but there's quite an Irish influx to the Combine over this particular year with the punting and kicking as they try and expand the kind of pathway for international athletes. So that was pretty big conversation point in Ireland over the last couple of days to see some of those like athletes from different sports here, rugby, Irish football, and so on, get an opportunity to kick at the Combine. So we'll leave that for a different time. But we also had Blair Andrews on last week, who we talked about, some of the drills, what we were looking for, and maybe what some of the players we were sent to watch. And we did joke about the potential of, somebody breaking the 40-yard dash record. And Xavier Worthy was the name that kind of came up. We kind of, I don't know if we said laughed it off, but we kind of thought we'll see how the test and equipment that he is using works versus the NFL Combine. But yeah, he broke the NFL Combine record. So we might even touch on him on today's show to see how that might affect his potential stock as we approach the NFL draft, because obviously there's a lot of conversation around it, but obviously we have his other measurables, including his weight being one of the main concerns. So we'll talk on today's show about wide receivers. We're going to come back later in the week, talk about running backs. But Shawn, I mentioned we had Blair on last week, so we have you back. We're on the road to recovery, hopefully, from some back issues. But how are you feeling as we sit here on Monday post NFL Combine?
Good. At least
you
good
didn't try any of the, you didn't try any of these, sprints or shuttles at your house.
No, I didn't participate in this one. So I was certainly one of the guys on the shelf. There was kind of a funny story and a painful story over the last week. Colm, the next time we do a non-football show, we'll have to get into that. I had a lot of people reach out to me say they
we'll do a show just detailed both our back issues.
I had a lot of people reach out saying that they had similar issues and were sending me good vibes, and so you always appreciate that. Again, the RotoViz OT community, the best out there, and also this issue with back problems as you move through your life, something that people do identify with. But Colm, the thing we really want to talk about today, and it just gets so exciting, is this Combine. We know that there are ways for the Combine to be overrated. We know that the Combine really risks an element of double counting, and yet the athleticism level of these players is going to be very important because, you're talking about professional sports, right? And at the very top level, if you have the speed to still run away from your opponents, if you have differentiating speed, differentiating athleticism, even compared to the top guys, that makes a difference. We saw that all year with the Miami Dolphins, where teams were so stretched to be able to handle the vertical speed of a Tyreek Hill, of a Devon Achane. You throw in guys like Mostert and Waddle, who also have elite speed. It makes a difference. And especially it can make a difference if you're also good. And so the Miami Dolphins were able to put together a bunch of guys who not only have track speed, but are good football players. That's the kind of thing that we're looking for here. And you started out with the headline, Xavier Worthy breaking the record. And this one is so interesting because he's a tiny guy. And I think before some of the things that we saw from Tank Dell last year, there would be even more skepticism about, what does it mean for a player to be that fast and still that small, especially if their most recent 2 years in college have a variety of red flags. One of the things that people know if they have the RotoViz rookie guide is that during that sophomore season when Worthy was used as a vertical receiver, he had a problem with drops, had a problem with those on-target catchable percentages. And people are going to look at some of those things and then also look at the element of just, how was that going to translate to the NFL level as a very small guy? And yet, Colm, one of the things that I threw out there a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about a few of these players that I do think is interesting and something that, Blair and I are going to look into more as we get deeper into the offseason, because I haven't taken a specific look at this in the last couple of years in going through the data. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that we were almost dealing with a couple of different almost different positions. Now, obviously, it's the same position. It's going to be the same position when they score you fantasy points, when you're trying to decide who you want to draft in best ball, who you want to put into your lineup in dynasty and redraft. And yet the big receivers and the small receivers have some different elements about them that really help you understand who is going to translate well to the NFL and become a star. So for the small receivers, it's this breakout age, and it's going to be the speed. For the big receivers, it's this final year production. And obviously, how does that size actually translate? You want to see the numbers, especially in that last year. You want to see big time production. And from that perspective, I think that we can be a little bit more enthusiastic than we might be if we took a more agnostic perspective on guys like Xavier Worthy and Rome Odunze, where both of those guys are actually probably more interesting than people are giving them credit for. Now, I mean, Odunze is a player who's very controversial because obviously the scouts see him as potentially a top 10 type of player. A lot of analytics people are looking at those first 2 seasons and say it's a big problem to not do much there, to have so much of it in that final year and in an offense that was so prolific. So we're not going to sweep those things under the table. I mean, RotoViz has been probably, the biggest voice in helping people understand the relevance of your trajectory through your collegiate career. And yet when we look at the numbers for both of these two guys within the context of what their bodies are and what their production has been, what they'll be asked to do at the NFL level, this is really cool because if you're like the two of us, where on our dynasty team, we have the 107, you don't want this to be something where the value falls off the table at the 106. Obviously, a lot of our listeners are going to have the 110, the 111, the 112. And also a lot of our listeners are going to have, 5 second-round picks, 5 third-round picks. They're looking at those spots and saying, is there actually going to be value there? Colm, this class became more interesting. And I especially think those third-round picks became more interesting when you look at some of the things that happened in the running back group that we'll talk about in the next show. I love this because it's just so much fun in general. I also love it as a dynasty manager with a lot of picks because I think that as good as this class is supposed to be, certainly when you think about the wide receivers, you think about a generational tight end, you now have J.J. McCarthy potentially making this a 4-player group at quarterback, where obviously in Superflex, that's going to push guys down to you further. This promises to be one of the most fun draft seasons ever. And the combine is one of the catalysts for that. This was so much fun.
A lot of fun. And you mentioned, the way it could affect the rookie drafts with the quarterbacks as well mixed in there. I do feel, and maybe by the time we get to the NFL draft, and then, those drafts are usually starting up pretty much straight away after those for the majority of leagues. But does it feel like this year there might be more than ever, like, a lack of consensus? Obviously, we'll get landing spots and so on, and draft capital will affect that. But it feels like at the moment there's a lot of people going in different directions at, the top players at each position across this group of prospects.
I think that that's potentially the case. I'm kind of in the position where, I'm not paying as much attention to some of those things right now as we would once we really do start to get a sense of where these guys are likely to go. I think especially pre-combine, when you're looking at draft slot projections, outside of these, top 20-ish players, I mean, guys are going to be able to rise and fall multiple rounds. So I don't think that you can take that and feel very confident about it or feel too worried about where other people are projecting players that early in the process. But now once we have the combine, we can start to see what consensus develops between scouts, the analytics groups that we know are going to have increasing roles in a lot of the individual front offices. Certainly, there's a lot of work done at RotoViz and certainly many other places across the fantasy community that does have some leakage across into even what NFL teams are deciding they want to do. And I think that that is fantastic. One of the things that I found in writing all of those blurbs for the rookie guide, and we will have another version coming out soon. Again, for anybody who didn't purchase yet, you can get all 3 versions for $20. Colm, this is a great time once you've got the combine numbers in your head and you're playing with our combine workout explorer, you're playing with the box score scout, maybe you're playing with the prospect labs, and then you want to go back in and think through some of the other advanced stats. so much of that stuff is in the rookie guide. And, I was going back through and refreshing myself with some of the very specific pieces of information that I'd written about a couple of weeks ago as it relates to these players. And one of the things that I thought was so interesting about this class is that there are a lot of guys who don't have the production on its face to be clear-cut first or second round picks whom you would then also feel confident picking in your rookie draft because you think they're going to perform right away. And yet there also were a lot of players who, if you gave them a little bit of the benefit of the doubt and you made an effort to understand their context, then I think if you also got a strong combine from them, you were going to feel like there was a possibility that they could be something at the next level. And you think about how many players had transferred. That was one of the notes that we got back from readers and purchasers of the guide, was that they didn't necessarily realize just how many people had transferred. You have all of those moves through different programs. You also, again, have the pandemic that's still really affecting so many players from this class. And I think that we have to understand on a human level that the situations for so many players in their programs, in their lives, are going to be so different than it might be for somebody in a different program who's in a little bit different dynamic as it relates to that year, right? So we worked through all of those things, and I don't think it's as straightforward a question about the age and experience trajectory as it has perhaps been in the past. Certainly you got some guys, just from last season, like a Puka, like a Zay Flowers. I mean, a couple of players who were among the most important in the entire fantasy universe last year, who are coming off of having been in college for 4 seasons. We know that the declare early is a big deal. It's not something, though, where if someone has been in college for 4 years, they're completely disqualified from being someone you look at. That would be ludicrous, especially as we continue to get more information on how this is working now. And also, Colm, the NFL drafts are going to be tighter themselves in the same way that we see fantasy drafts being tighter. So some of the advantages we've talked about in the past, as teams follow those ideas as well and are making adjustments on their board, you're going to have to look at that a little bit differently. So again, that brings us back to the combine, who performed well, who gave themselves a chance. And beyond Xavier Worthy, who I think we can now look at as a very clear-cut first-round pick. I mean, this is a guy who runs a 4.21 40. And I mean, these guys all look fast, but what he did there and just the look of it as he's running, it's a very similar type of dynamic to a Tyreek Hill, where you're thinking to yourself just immediately, like, how would a defense ever stay in front of him? Right. So it's hard for me to believe that he could possibly get out of the first round. It's hard for me to believe that he could possibly be passed on a team like the Kansas City Chiefs. You think about Hill, a different body type, a lot thicker. But it wasn't just this straight line speed, right? You have the elite 10-yard split. You've got the 41-inch vertical. You have an almost 11-foot broad jump. Xavier Worthy going to be hard to guard. And you go back and you look at him having one of the greatest freshman seasons in NCAA football history. This is a guy I think could push to the top 10, right? The top 10 picks of the draft. Now, you're going to have a specific team want to pick you, like Henry Ruggs had the Raiders want to overdraft him at that point. I don't even know with Worthy there would be an overdraft, because you were talking about a guy who was much more productive in college, is much faster even than Ruggs was. And you look at that, you're still going to need a team who wants to spend that type of draft capital on a small dude when there are so many other options. Colm, now that I've made the claim that Worthy could go in the top 10 reality picks, what's your thought on Worthy? Am I getting too excited? Again, I mean, we knew he was going to be fast.
We certainly knew he was going to be fast. That was, again, what we talked about with Blair last week. So we had factored that in, but we didn't, I guess I didn't believe that he was this fast. And we're only talking about, certain splits in terms of the gap to one, not being as fast potentially. That's the way. Not being as fast is slower than being this fast. But I think you mentioned the first round, and I think first round at the moment is fair. And I think what is going to happen is we always see it. You mentioned double counting at the start of the show. I think that by the time we get to the NFL draft, a team is going to have fallen in love with him so much that I don't know if your top 10 prediction is that outlandish in terms of where he could go. I think, you mentioned the situation with Ruggs and the Raiders. I think that we'll see somebody want to get him, and it's a case of there's nobody else is running the combine faster than him. Somebody's going to want to take an opportunity and have that athletic player of that particular caliber on their roster. So I feel like it's going to continue to sneak up, but I would imagine at the moment, 20 to 25 is where I would be probably most comfortable trying to get him on the roster. But I think somebody's going to make the move to take him much earlier than that. The part I wanted to ask is, we said we knew he was fast, but not this fast. Where do you kind of have the feeling on double counting a stat from, where he could have been drafted a week ago versus where he's potentially going to be drafted now, with taking these test results into consideration?
Colm, I think people may look at some of the projections that had him in the second half of the second round and think that this is an absurd overreaction, because one of the things that we do know is that fast players can sometimes get massively overdrafted, and there would be an element there of valuing the wrong thing and double counting. I don't know that that's the case for Worthy, because second half of the second round was probably always fairly absurd for him, unless your argument is just that there are so many good receivers in this draft that you could wait on somebody with a profile like his, where maybe you want more size, maybe you want better hands, that type of thing. And certainly, if you could have Worthy with more size and better hands, then, you'd be talking about a guy who, not just threatening Marvin Harrison, but better than him. I mean, if you had those additional elements, right? But when you're talking about Worthy here, you're talking about a guy who at age 18 went for almost 1,000 receiving yards, put up 12 touchdowns, averages almost 16 yards per reception. And then you look at some of the additional numbers. This is a guy who's at 2.9 yards per team attempt, 39% dominator rating. We're talking about a player who, for his career, even with some of the things that happened with all of those drops, even with all of the players that he was competing with for touches later on, because we have a lot of reason to believe that Adonai Mitchell is going to go relatively early, that Jatavian Sanders is going to go relatively early. I mean, he finishes with a 28% career receiving yardage share, which is, again, at the level that players go on to be successful in the NFL. You take that and you add a 4.21 40 on top of it. For me, not only is this a lot of fun, and would you like to see him on your team, whether that be the Chiefs or obviously one of the other 31, it's also a deal where after we watched the Dolphins, and with there being so much copycat element to the NFL, justifiably, right? You want to copy what the Dolphins did. We know that there are a lot of teams that run similar schemes that were copying what they're doing with motion. We know that this Shanahan or McVay or whoever you want to give credit to, Kubiak, the coaching tree here has now spread its tentacles throughout the NFL in this offseason, to the extent that a huge number of teams,
everywhere.
Right, it's everywhere. So, I mean, almost everyone is going to want to have this element to their offense. Xavier Worthy gives it to you. And even the other players, like we're going to talk about next, for example, of Brian Thomas, who very clearly solidified himself in the first round and maybe even in the top 15 picks, which I would have said a week ago, to me at least, seemed kind of outlandish. Even with the other options, I mean, there's a huge difference between someone who runs a 4.21 and someone who runs a 4.35. I mean, you're talking about the same difference between a 4.35 guy and a guy who runs a 4.5.
Yeah.
You can't stay with a 4.2 40 player, which is one of the reasons why Tyreek Hill is always wide open. If you can also play a little bit of football, which Xavier Worthy can, it just completely wrecks everything the opposing defense is trying to do. I think that you've got to pick him early.
You mentioned Brian Robinson, so let's jump into some of the other guys, that got hype, but obviously the record being broken led to a lot of conversation over the last couple of days. But who are some of the names that, I guess, and I'll let you lead whatever direction you want, but potentially players who risen in your mind over the last kind of 72 hours, since the testing and the results come through? Is there any players that either rose, fell, surprised you, made you think that they're going to go in the top 15 picks?
Yeah, I think that the Brian Thomas results are really important there. He's the number one player in freak score for this year, tied with Johnny Wilson, who, as a 6'6", 230-pound guy, Wilson sort of operating in a different category there. But Thomas to be almost 6'3", 209 pounds, to run that 4.33, I mean, he's going to be somebody who is more or less always open at the NFL level, somebody who scored a lot of touchdowns last season. Now with him, the question is, why was there not more production in those first couple of seasons? And then obviously he still falls well below Malik Neighbors in terms of the production this last year. Is it something where we're going to get a little bit of an inflation of what he really is, because you obviously are in this offense where the QB is the Heisman Trophy winner, and yet his numbers this last season with a great drop rate, elite on target catch percentage, a bigger player who also evaded 15 tackles. I mean, this is a guy now who looks like a star. And so, one of the things that Blair mentions in his article there is that you have a freak score that's similar to Andre Johnson, Amari Cooper. You have Christian Watson also popping up in the Combine Explorer as one of his top physical comps. When you think about the excitement that there was around Watson as a player who maybe was on the same trajectory, but later on in his college career and doing it at a small school, and then how uncoverable he has looked at times with the Green Bay Packers. With Watson, it's mostly been a matter of health, and then how that translates to routes, especially with the wide variety of other players they've had come up. I mean, you're thinking about a player who's a much better prospect when we remove all of the red flags than a Watson had. I mean, Brian Thomas, somebody who now I think is a legitimate pick in that, as early as say 105, but because of the other guys who were there, when you're talking about Superflex, I mean, you're probably going to be able to get him in that 107 to 111 range. Another reason why you don't trade these future first round picks, even if your team is a juggernaut, even if you're saying, I'm going to be the league winner, I'm going to be the champion, my pick is not going to be worth as much. Well, it could be worth a Brian Thomas down the line, and or Thomas's combine pushes other players down to you who are exciting. A couple of names who are a little bit fringier. We have a Xavier Legette, who puts up a 77 in terms of the freak score. And he's someone who, with his size, as a 221-pound wide receiver, to run a sub 4.40, to have a 40-inch vertical leap. Again, you're talking about a guy who potentially offers some interesting run after the catch elements, but also should be a jump ball type of threat. Now, with Legette, it's even more than Thomas, where you're like, where were the first 4 years of production? And then you had that final year breakout. So he's someone a little bit more like a Martavis Bryant or that type of player where, I mean, hopefully they don't get, pushed so high in the draft that you're having to pay a ton. But certainly if they go to the right team, or you have a quarterback who can work with a player like this, who's had some production issues, but you're looking at the top physical comps for someone like this. And again, you're like Andre Johnson being a guy there, Javon Walker, who obviously was a star for the Packers before, had some injury issues coming through. You have, some other players who maybe don't pan out in the same way, like a Derrick Rogers or a Charles Johnson, players who are very trendy at this point because they were so athletic at that size. And yet you have to look at the full picture, obviously. So still plenty of red flags there, but he's going to be one of these guys where once you get deeper into your draft, it becomes very interesting to see what he can do. He's somebody who occasionally gets mocked to the Chiefs because they've taken some players like this in the past. There are some at least mild comparisons to a player like a Rashee Rice. Obviously, if you get him with a Patrick Mahomes, if you get him on a team, for example, in Buffalo there. And Buffalo probably looking for more receiving punch. Then it becomes pretty interesting. I mentioned Worthy's teammate. I mean, these Texas guys help themselves an absolute ton because we know where they were in terms of competing for targets. But this is a player who 6'2", 205, goes and runs a 4.34 40, is in the
And that's Mitchell you're talking about?
Yeah, 98th percentile explosion score. You put those things together with some of the interesting things that he did, right? So this is a player where he was originally a recruit to Georgia. And even when you go back, and this was the thing about actually looking at the context for some of these players, he immediately ran more routes, generated more targets, and created more air yards than Ladd McConkey or Jermaine Burton. And both of those guys, pretty interesting players. He would obviously have been competing with Brock Bowers for targets. You end up at Texas and you have this 55 for 845 and 11 line. That's a 32% dominator on a team with Worthy, right? And so again, you've got a great on-target catch percentage. You have that vertical ability with the 15 ADOT. You put all of those pieces together and he looks like somebody who could be a first-round pick. And certainly if you have a team maybe toward the end of the first round where you have an elite quarterback, you're looking for that piece of the puzzle to challenge defenses and to create a dynamic where they can't match up with everything that you want to do. You're going to stress them in a certain way on every single play because you have a guy with that type of size and athleticism. He becomes really interesting, even though, again, the full profile is not what you necessarily want from a first-round pick.
The one thing with this draft class that feels pretty clear in terms of, in terms of the freak scores, when we look through it, and there's obviously some of the guys didn't test, but the guys who did test, there's only 7 that failed to have a time quicker than 4.5 seconds out of the group here for the wide receivers. And when we're looking at the freak scores, there's only 6 of the players who tested below a 50. Looking through, the upper end and the gold standard for the freak score would be a Calvin Johnson or a Julio Jones. DK Metcalf came in with a 91 when he had his combine. But, the guys we talked about today, Brian Thomas, 80, Johnny Wilson, 80, Legette, 77, Mitchell, 74. It's a very kind of, there's guys there at the top end of the freak score, but it's quite level and throughout in terms of only 6 players have a freak score below 50 from the entire group that did test. So there's not many that are, I guess we'll say bad athletes, Shawn, in this group. But is there any of the names that really struggled this week in terms of those freak score results, and Isaiah Williams and Jacob Cowan, for example? Any names that you were surprised by how poor they tested?
I don't necessarily think so, in that some of the guys you see at the bottom with a Malik Washington at his size, you would have preferred more than a 4.47, a Jacob Cowing. At his size, again, you're talking about 5'8", 168. You prefer more than a 4.38. It seems really strange to say, a 4.38 doesn't work for this player. But one of the things Blair points out is that, unfortunately, because your entire profile does matter, if you're a tiny dude trying to play at the NFL level, you really would like to have like a 4.25 or a 4.27, something in there. The overall numbers for him, again, and some of the other peripheral workouts were just not what you want to see. His 3-cone, his short shuttle, both well above where you would need to be for a player of that size. I mean, you want them to be a Dante Hall type of guy. And so that part I think is frustrating because those players did so much cool stuff on the college field and you're rooting for them. You want to see some of these underdog stories come through. I don't think that, you're going to take these guys completely off your board, but it does move them down. Colm, the one other player I want to mention quickly, kind of as we close up here, someone that I thought had a really interesting bio to write about for the guide, someone that Curtis wanted to make sure that we pushed up above sort of consensus in the first version of our draft guide. Devontez Walker, also with a very nice combine. He's somebody who played at Kent State and broke out early with some big production there. He moves on to North Carolina. His ADOT jumps from 14, already high, to 17. He gets a 95% on target catch percentage. He goes over the breakout level for dominator rating again. So he obviously had broken out earlier, but maybe you're thinking, okay, those Kent State numbers don't really count. It's a different level of competition. To see him immediately do it again in North Carolina is encouraging. Over his last 2 seasons, he's got 19 total touchdowns. So you look at Walker here, and again, a guy who's over 6 feet tall, runs that 4.36 40, has a 97th percentile explosion score with elite broad jumps and a 40.5-inch vertical. I mean, this is a guy who, again, you're talking about physical comps to like a Jamar Chase. And you don't expect him to go out there and be Chase, obviously. But this part, I think, was really encouraging. Now, his 10-yard split wasn't great, and so perhaps there's a little bit of build-up speed here. But again, when you're talking about a player who has been a vertical weapon in college, has been a touchdown scorer, when you get this type of speed and leaping ability, we're talking about players who in the contemporary NFL, where explosives are being taken away, where teams need to have an ability to stretch defenses, to threaten over the top, to still create some of those plays. And we're going to see offenses figure out how to address some of these issues. But part of it is not going to be X's and O's. It's going to be you have to have the guys. And Walker's somebody who potentially gives that to you. I think that his combine as well, very, very exciting.
So we are going to leave it there for wide receivers. We're going to come back and talk a little bit of the running back position on the show later this week. But what I would say is if there's any players that you want us to dive into, talk about a little bit more, feel free to share them with us. You can leave a comment on the YouTube channel, or you can send them across to myself on Twitter at Overtime Ireland, or email them across to rotovizradio@gmail.com. That also goes for any questions, topics, and so on. Shawn teased earlier, maybe doing another Q&A show. If that's the case, you can also send us some suggestions outside of us talking about debilitating back pain for 30 minutes to share our stories. But that is going to do it for today's edition. Shawn also mentioned the draft guide available up on rotoviz.com. There will be a link in today's show notes if you want to head over and make a purchase there. My name is Colm Kelly. You can follow me on Twitter at Overtime Ireland. My co-host is Shawn Siegele. Check out Shawn's work up on rotoviz.com. And until we are back, have a good one.